Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone. This is Dylan in the host chair, off for another adventure in alternate history. I have with me a couple of distinguished gentlemen. Robert Koshu is with us today with his Houston hat on. How you doing, Robert?
Very nice, thank you.
And we have our other distinguished gentleman on the podcast. Do you have any words for the nice people at home?
Hi, good people.
Chris Capola is with us too today, everybody. So we're kind of taking a little bit of an adventure out of our usual wheelhouse. We tend to focus a lot of times on kind of recent history, the 1800s, the 1900s, and the kind of that sort of ballpark. But today we're going to go back in time a little bit. We're going to quite possibly upend the entire game table that is Western European development with this one. We're going all the way back to what used to be known as the Dark Ages, but is now probably more accurately described as the early medieval or the post-Roman period. We're going back to the Islamic conquest of Spain and their impending march into Europe. We're going to explore what would happen if a lesser-known battle had turned out very differently. Now, stay with me for a little bit, because this one's a bit kind of requires some explanation. The Battle of Tours in 732 is famous in Western European history for being sort of the end of Muslim conquest after the explosion of the Islamic faith all across North Africa into Spain. Tours in 732, or Poitiers, depending on how you learned it, is typically seen as the end of this advance into Europe.
Let's be honest, Dylan. All of us learned it from Age of Empires 2.
Yeah.
It's Tours.
It's Tours. I was trying to be polite, but yeah, I learned it from Age of Empires just like everybody else. The Battle of Tours. Charles Martel, or as I affectionately call him, Charlie the Mallet Man, basically leads a Frankish army and stops the Umayyad advance into Western Europe. But what often gets overlooked is probably an equally significant battle that happened 12 years earlier, 721. This is the Battle of Toulouse. And at this battle, Duke Odo of Aquitaine, who ruled southern France, nominally a liege of the Frankish kings, but in effect, he was essentially his own political power. He basically bent the knee just out of custom and practice, but he was basically his own independent ruler.
He's referred to as Odo the Great for a reason.
Odo the Great, because of this battle, Odo becomes Odo the Great. But Odo in 721 defends the city of Toulouse in Aquitaine in southern France from a Muslim army. Basically, what happens is the Umayyad Islamic forces come across the Pyrenees. They start rampaging through southern France. They go to Toulouse, and rather than actually fight, Odo hightails it out of there. He needs to go get help. He's got to go light the beacons and hope Rohan answers the call for aid. While he's out doing that, the Muslims siege the city. But the Islamic forces get a little cocky. They don't, because Odo hightails it, they think they've basically got the city on lockdown. They don't do a lot of their advanced reconnaissance that they should have been doing. They don't really have a whole lot of guards on the backside of the outer sort of ring of the siege. They're focused on the city, not what's happening around them. So all of a sudden, when Odo comes back with an army of other Franks, he catches them by surprise. And essentially, the Muslims are caught between a rock and a French place. And Odo essentially completely, destroys the Muslim army, and Toulouse is a Christian Frankish victory. However, our fork that really deals more with the Battle of Tours is actually, what if this battle in Toulouse in 721 had ended up being a Muslim victory? What if the Muslims had actually used this advanced reconnaissance, had posted guards, had developed some fortifications, and not just assumed that the Franks were done, and the Muslims had actually fought off Odo at the Battle of Toulouse, and the Battle of Toulouse becomes a Muslim victory instead of a Frankish victory. Now, in our timeline, Charles Martel, after Toulouse, he defends another Muslim invasion. It comes up 2 tours. But in this situation, if Toulouse becomes a Muslim victory, that throws essentially all of our understanding of Frankish politics, and especially the south of France, into a completely different situation in the aftermath of this battle. So now that we've got that set up, I want to see what you guys think is going to be happening kind of in the immediate aftermath of a Frankish defeat at Toulouse and the loss of essentially most of southern France to the Umayyad Caliphate and Al-Andalus.
So the first thing I want to ask is this, just to kind of go a little bit further back. Basically, the Umayyad Caliphate rides out of Arabia during the time of Muhammad and conquers all of North Africa, conquers the Middle East, almost stopped around what we consider Turkey today, kind of into Syria,
essentially the edge of Byzantine territory.
Yep.
And has now gone over the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain. If they do not kind of crest at Poitiers, do they stop? Where do they stop? Is southern France still Christian, or do they just keep going?
So I think
because they have been on a bit of a run.
Yeah, they've been on a bit of a tear, and I think they certainly would have attempted to go further north. Mm-hmm. And I think that gets into the interesting part of the discussion, because this is, on the one hand, you have a Muslim army that's basically gone from win to win. Mm-hmm. Ever since they got out of Arabia, they have basically never been beat up until this point. So I can see the desire there to keep going. And I think they certainly would at least attempt some forays, probably not into Italy, at least at first. They're going to keep, I think, going against the Franks. But at the same time, they're about to run into the same problem that the Romans did. Once you have this much territory, it is very hard to keep it together and functioning, because now the Islamic Caliphate stretches from the Persian Gulf all the way up to Provence, essentially, southern France, all the way around North Africa. That is a lot of territory to have to try and deal with.
It's even into more or less India at that point. I mean,
yeah.
Well, and not only that, but the Romans maintained it for as long as they maintained it, because the Romans pretty much adopted the send us tax money, burn a little incense to the emperor, and we're going to leave you alone, let you do your thing.
Yeah, and I think
that was not the Muslims' way of doing it.
No, not at first, at least. Once you get into the later existence of Andalusia and Spain in particular, that becomes kind of the practice. But at this point, that is not kind of entrenched yet. Moorish Spain is not what we understand as sort of historical Moorish Spain quite yet. So I think my suspicion is that Toulouse, if it's a Muslim victory, I think they are going to. I think it's a close enough fight. They're going to have to at least take a bit of a breather, even if it's just for a year or two before they worry about doing anything else, because they've conquered a lot of people who are not historically Muslim or, kind of any of the Arabian or North African cultures that would have been more familiar to Islam. They're in sort of relatively long-held Christian territory at this point. So their administrative difficulties are going to start getting exponentially worse. So in the 720s, probably towards the end, I think that's when you start seeing, maybe like after 725, 726, that's when you start seeing Andalusian pushes up towards the rest of Frankish territory. And that gets us into the other side of this equation, because we've talked about the Muslims. We haven't really talked about what happens with the Franks after this. And this is a Frankish kingdom that's before Charlemagne. Charles Martel is Charlemagne's grandfather. So this is the very beginning of the switch from the Merovingian kings of France, and no, not Merovingian like the weird guy from the second Matrix movie, but that is where they get the name from. This is essentially the old regime of the Frankish kings, and basically Charles Martel, as mayor of the palace, basically completely usurps all of their authority. And he, in our timeline, spends most of the 710s and 720s consolidating the foundations of what we understand as the sort of giant Frankish empire that stretches all the way from the Pyrenees to the middle of Germany. But in this timeline, Charles Martel basically loses half of his Frankish heartland. So he's got, even if he still has the control that he has over the northern part, he has a whole lot of shoring up to do, because people are going to start looking around and trying to see where the exits at least are, if not go for him yet, I think.
Yeah, because he loses if Odo loses part of the army that later Charles grabs.
Yes,
for the battle.
Because Odo
Tours.
fights. Yeah, Odo fights at Tours with Charles Martel.
Yeah. So you lose. I'm going to assume, and I think it's a safe assumption that Charles does not survive. Not Charles. I'm sorry. Odo does not survive, and so you don't have Odo.
I think Odo might. Odo as a person might, because as I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, Dylan, Odo is out collecting.
He collects all the forces.
Allies.
Yeah, he comes
so
back.
If they go into Tours and conquer Tours, he's not in Tours.
He's not in Toulouse, but he is.
Toulouse.
Yeah, Toulouse.
Yeah.
But I think he gets captured and held as a hostage.
Because it's very possible if they go into Toulouse, he just keeps looking for more and more support and never comes.
Or he does that. He just disappears, kind of as this, sort of wandering noble. To use a paradox, analogy. He's a wandering noble who has claims, and you never want to press them when you're in his court.
He is not the player.
No,
he was though. He is off the board.
Yeah, he is.
So, and I think when you lose that, now Charles has much more difficulty with his army at Tours.
Yeah, and he also loses this kind of period of quiet after they win at Toulouse.
Yeah,
and that's when Charles in the 720s, he's done consolidating kind of the northern heartland of the Frankish territory. He actually goes east and starts beating up the Saxons and some of the other Germanic tribes on sort of the fringes in kind of Western Germany and the Low Countries, and adds them into his territory. So if he doesn't have this sort of shored up 720s, I don't think he's going to do nearly as much of that, because he's going to be worried that the Muslims are going to come up from the south and come in the sort of back door while he's out running around. So I think Charles is going to have a much smaller power base to take advantage of in the eventual rematch, if you will. And I guess to get this out of the way, I do think the rematch ends up happening somewhere around Tours. It's kind of the natural place for any army coming up from southern France to kind of go up towards Paris and the northern French heartland. I think that's kind of the edge of Aquitanian versus northern French territory. So it's going to happen around there. But I think the question that we're kind of naturally getting to is, when that rematch happens, how does it go? Because you've got a weakened Charles, still very strong. I'll admit, Charles Martel was probably the strongest in our timeline ruler in Europe, period. End of sentence. He was probably the strongest medieval king until Charlemagne, since the end of the Romans.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. Well,
but
I think it's half the time. So 721 to 732, roughly, I'd say 727, 728.
Mm-hmm.
Because he doesn't get the long time. The caliphate sits back for a little bit, licks its wounds, shores up
realizes
supports,
we need to finish this off,
and then basically they do the old Santa Anna sitting at the Alamo for a couple of weeks to pack it up, and then okay, we got to finish it. Let's go.
Yeah. And that kind of gets, so I think and so me personally, and I'm curious to see what you guys think about this. I think Tours probably still is a pretty close fought battle, because even in our timeline, Tours was a very hard fought battle. I think it still ends up kind of playing out the same way. Just quick military tactical detour. Tours was the kind of classic, even into antiquity. You see this at Gaugamela with Alexander the Great and the Persians. For example, you have a sort of primarily close formation, heavy infantry force, armored, shield walls, almost a successor to a phalanx formation, like tight squares.
It's a Greek phalanx, basically.
Yeah, it's the same sort of tactics, even if the weapons are different. Versus a Muslim kind of mobile cavalry focused force. They have some auxiliaries, they have some foot troops, they have some skirmishers, but primarily the Islamic forces are known for their cavalry. That's how they got all the way from Arabia across North Africa up to Spain and into southern France. So that's their baby. At Tours in our timeline, the Frankish formation kept fighting off these Muslim cavalry attacks. Even though they would get in, they would never completely shatter these tight formations. I think that still kind of plays out on the ground. You know, the pieces move the same way, but you don't have as many Frankish troops. So I think Charles Martel probably barely gets out with what we would consider a draw. Or it might be a Pyrrhic victory where he technically wins and beats the Muslims off this battle, but it's not something that he can do more than once unless he has a chance to go back home and take a break and try and do something to get back on the front foot.
And he doesn't throw them out.
Right.
No, I don't think he can.
At the end of it.
He stops them and they kind of go back and go back to southern France. But I don't think Charles is going to drive them all the way out of France. I don't think he can. So that basically leaves us with kind of a very shaky Frankish northern half of France, and the Muslims starting to entrench in sort of Aquitaine and southern France, I guess, is the end of this alternate Battle of Tours. It's kind of a stalemate. Nobody quite knows who wins. The battle lines don't change all that much on the board, but everybody is hurting a little bit, and everybody's kind of like, maybe we're not sure exactly what's going to go from here. So I guess the big question is, because this is such a foundational thing in Western European development in the Middle Ages. Like, this is what makes France in the Middle Ages. Even though they're not France yet, this is what does that. You know, this is what consolidates all
the natural borders of France.
Exactly.
After Napoleon, like during Napoleon and during Louis XIV and stuff, they're expanding outside of it. But the idea of the Rhine and the Pyrenees, this is what France is supposed to be.
Exactly. And that I think is the first big change that comes out of this different sequence of battles, because that is no longer the case. You now have, you know, both a cultural and a religious, to some extent, difference between the two parts of France. Yeah, you just don't have France. Essentially the Low Countries get exponentially bigger, and some of what we would understand as northern France probably ends up culturally being kind of more aligned with sort of Brittany.
Do the Saxons and the Vikings and the others take advantage of Charles's weakness at this point?
Yeah, I think the Saxons are definitely an immediate concern, because, you know, that's who Charles was fighting in the East in the 720s anyway. A lot of them are kind of not, you know, they're not the premier polities on the block. So I don't think Charles is at risk of really being conquered per se, but he's definitely going to have to deal with, you know, raids on the eastern border, some skirmishes, you know, attacks here and there. I think he's more going to have trouble keeping his house in order in terms of all these Frankish nobles that kind of rule their own independent places. They're going to have much more authority than in our timeline, when Charles could basically rule with an iron fist because he had consolidated power so much. The Vikings are going to come in a little later because Lindisfarne doesn't happen. The first sort of, widely recognized Viking raid doesn't start till 793 in England. So the Vikings are very much going to come into the picture kind of in the early 800s in France. And I think that's where northern France is going to become very different from how we understand it. I think, Normandy, quote unquote, what we understand as Normandy, the Vikings, I think, are still going to settle there. But I don't think it's going to end up being a bribe from Louis the Stammerer, if I remember correctly. Basically, Louis the Stammerer, one of Charlemagne's sons, basically gives the Duchy of Normandy to this mythical Viking Rollo to settle and essentially act as the bar on the front door so the Vikings will stop sailing down the Seine and sacking Paris, because the Vikings understand how riverboats work, unlike anyone else in the Middle Ages. I think instead the Vikings, once you get to the early 800s, I think they're just going to take it. I don't think it's going to be necessarily as much right off the bat, but I think the Vikings are going to get some footholds in Normandy, and they're going to gradually kind of encroach as Charles and some of his sons kind of naturally, I think, have trouble maintaining their consolidated power, and kind of it shrinks and fractures a little bit. Because the other thing about the Frankish hereditary system is when a father dies, his sons split all of his territories equally, which is why you have Charlemagne's sons split into, the Frankish kingdom, Lotharingia, Austrasia, which becomes Germany, and the sort of Italian Lombard kingdom. When Charlemagne dies, there are 4 kingdoms that come out of that. So I think when Charles dies, that's going to be the thing that ends up happening, because that's the natural Frankish succession. I forget how many sons he has, but it's going to be a breakup of that state right around the time when the Vikings are coming in. And I think that's what's going to kind of finally fracture our understanding of France and turning it into almost a Viking Normandy as the French polity, the Frankish polity.
So I'm wondering right now, I kind of described in my pre-podcast when we talked, I said France becomes kind of like almost 18th century Germany, where everybody fights over it. And I think what's striking me thinking about this is, even if the Umayyad Caliphate has its issues back home, and even if, let's say, Al-Andalus becomes an independent polity, they still have plenty to keep playing in France. And I think, especially when you have the Vikings coming in, man, the Franks are just going to get squeezed out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We talked about, we discussed the ideas of the natural borders of France. What is the natural border between a Viking Norman state and a Al-Andalus Caliphate? There isn't one. If there isn't one, they're going to keep trying to draw one.
Yeah.
Violently.
And that's one of the reasons.
And basically you're being pinched.
Yeah, exactly.
They're in a classic pincer move.
Yeah.
At this point.
Because basically the border, in my head, I've been functioning with the sort of, I think the border of this sort of Andalusian Aquitaine, for lack of a better name, is going to be the Loire River that runs through Tours. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the geographic boundary. But north of that, there's really nothing until you hit the Norman coast. So I think you're exactly right. I think the Vikings, especially in northern France, are going to just push the French into the Loire, and the Muslims, whether they try and conquer north of that or not, because there's another thing that happens in Andalusian Spain that we haven't mentioned yet that's going to throw the whole Muslim geopolitical chessboard. I think the Vikings are going to some extent, squeeze out, to some extent, assimilate the Franks into sort of their Norman kingdom. Because the Franks are a Germanic tribe still at this point. They're a very Romanized Germanic tribe, but they are still a Germanic tribe, which has a lot of kind of cultural ties still with the Vikings at this point. They're just slightly more cultured Vikings at this point. Well, more than slightly. But at the same time, we also have to talk about how the Muslims basically get cracked in half right as this is all happening. In 750 and 751, only about 20 years after our Toulouse and Tours kind of settled the map, the Umayyad Caliphate breaks out into civil war. And I won't bore you with the details, but the result of that is that Spain and kind of some of North Africa becomes its own Muslim state. This is the beginning of what we understand as sort of Moorish Spain as an independent thing separate from the main Islamic world. So if that still happens, there are much bigger kind of Andalusian Spain with this Aquitaine territory or tributary or whatever. But they don't necessarily have the complete backup of the main primary Islamic Caliphate in North Africa and Arabia. So I think that also probably puts less pressure, I would imagine, on the Franks from the Muslims and actually makes the Vikings the primary antagonist for the Franks in this period.
It's a hammer and an anvil.
Yeah. And I think the Muslims function more as the anvil. Yeah.
They're the anvil that the Vikings are pressing against.
Yeah.
The Muslims say, hey, whatever, we'll keep the Burgundy area. It's ours. Back off. Because remember, the Berber revolt ends with basically a bunch of Arab troops in Spain to put it down.
Yeah. And I think that also, one thing that kind of begs the question of is, so this is, Tours happens maybe 50, 60, 70 years before Charlemagne gets proclaimed Holy Roman Emperor in 801, 802. So 70 years before this. That requires a centralized Frankish kingdom, but that also requires a pope who's willing to play ball. And I think in this
the Pope
scenario
has his own little problems at this
exactly. And I think the Pope, even if he does something like that, I think the Pope's got a different horse now because the Franks are not the big dogs on the block. I think in the absence of the Franks, the Lombards are the only guys left who really make sense from a geopolitical standpoint for the Pope to try and back. And they're not really his friends.
Yeah, the Lombards have their own history with the Papal State.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually the Lombards, I think, are a direct successor to the Goths who actually sacked Rome in 476. So this is kind of that direct Germanic tribal lineage. And they do end up kind of coming to a bit of a détente with the Pope eventually. But as Tours and Toulouse are happening, the Lombards are actively occupying Ravenna, which is at this point the Duchy of Rome itself.
And the Pope does not have a choice.
Yeah.
Because he's being squeezed between the Lombards and the Byzantines, basically.
Yeah. So I think the Pope ends up, instead of playing kingmaker, I think he ends up almost trying to act as an intermediary or as a conciliator between the Lombards, who are on his north, and the Byzantines, who are on his south. But the important thing is they're still Christian. Everybody else to his west and to his south, that is either a firm negative or at the very least a very uncertain question. So I think from his position as, the kind of, leader of the Catholic faith, and two, wanting to have some place to sleep at night, I think he's going to end up trying to essentially tie the Lombards closer together with the Byzantines, at least to get some kind of Christian front together that can stand what looks like is going to be, even if the Christians don't understand some of the backdoor politics of, Islamic territory, what they think is going to be essentially this wave of Islamic invaders coming into Christian territory.
I mean, I'm thinking about it, and we talked about this a little bit. I don't know if the Pope survives. I don't know if, Western Catholicism survives. because
Does it just give up and move to Constantinople at that
or does
the
Does
papacy
it become almost
dies?
like Coptic
Does it-
Christianity?
Yeah.
does it just get squeezed between? I'm going to keep calling it Al-Andalus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Byzantines, because let's look at this. The Byzantines have all of the Balkans, all of Greece, all of modern Turkey, basically. Al-Andalus has southern France, Spain, North Africa. Whatever we're talking about, whatever alliance, whatever between the Lombards and the Pope is now half of one country.
Yeah.
Yep.
Unless they are very good at playing the other two big kids off against each other.
And none of the popes have played off that
No.
Yeah.
at all. That's just not been in a papal
Like,
nature, as it were.
without the Franks, without
Yeah.
that, man, it gets real hard to see how a Catholic church survives. That's just what I think.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
there is no St. Peter's Basilica. There is no Vatican City. There is no what we think of as the Pope's realm, basically.
Well, and this is, I believe, still before the Great Schism.
Mm-hmm.
So this is before the really big defining split between, what is now Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity.
Okay.
So I do think there is potential for some sort of merger of the two.
But it would be kind of like basically because within Catholicism, technically the Pope is just the Bishop of Rome.
Correct.
And within Eastern Orthodoxy, you have the patriarchs of the different.
Yeah.
So basically, the Patriarch of Rome would lose his pretensions to being the first among equals, but that's the main effect of it.
Yeah. And I think he still maintains his position as kind of a regional power broker.
Yeah, but the same way that the Patriarch of, to this day, the Patriarch of Ukraine versus the Patriarch of Russia, the Patriarch of Serbia. Yeah.
And I think not to get too far ahead, but I do think since we've mentioned the Byzantines, it's worth giving at least a little bit of understanding of where they're at right now. Basically, the Byzantines suffer a long and slow decline, basically from when Rome falls in the late 400s, all the way until the Ottomans take Constantinople. We're kind of right before the second dead cat bounce, where they kind of come back a little bit for about 100 years after this. Empress Irene really kind of brings them back on the stage. At one point, she and Charlemagne talk about actually trying to potentially unite the Holy Roman Empire with the Byzantine Empire. That doesn't work. After about 100, 120 years, they kind of, start declining again. They get one more kind of dead cat bounce right around the time of the first couple crusades. And then once the fourth crusade happens, they're basically just a dead man walking. But the Byzantines are so good at not letting anybody onto that fact, they stick around for another 300-400 years after that. So the Byzantines are still very much a concern, but from the outside, they look a lot more important than they probably really are in the grand scheme of things.
So if the Byzantines, kind of in this scenario we're talking about, the Byzantines would basically absorb the Lombards. Is that kind of what we
I don't know about absorb, but at least they would have a much closer working relationship. I don't think they would be as antagonistic. I think the Lombards would probably acknowledge Byzantine control of the old Greek colonial area in Syracuse and southern Italy. And the Byzantines would probably be like, all right, you guys are going to be like the old Roman Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul.
Okay.
You guys get that part.
Yeah, and I agree that it's very easy for these two groups to get along, but how does that play?
You don't get the papal states.
None whatsoever.
Yeah, you don't get the papal states
at all. They are
There
done
is no. There
because
is.
Pepin gave the land
Yep.
to. I'm looking at to
Mhm. I mean,
Stephen the Second.
what you probably have
Yep.
is basically the Byzantines control actual Italy, southern Italy.
Yeah.
Kind of traditional kingdom of the two Sicilies.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I don't know that they necessarily fight over Rome, but Rome is kind of in the middle and might, the Lombard, maybe they'll let the Lombards have that as a base.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's probably, because let's not forget the Lombards are at least ostensibly Christian.
Mhm.
So the Byzantines probably have enough weight to throw around to be like, hey, we're going to let you control the Duchy of Ravenna and Rome, but you're going to have to, like, the leash that you're going to have the Pope on is going to be pretty long.
Mhm.
So the Pope, even though he's not necessarily going to be independent, I have to imagine part of the understanding between the Lombards and the Byzantines is going to give the Pope at least, if not direct political control, he's going to have a lot of operational leeway over at least Rome and kind of the immediate environs.
Because, the one thing about what we've just done, I think, is, at least in my understanding of early medieval popes, they were always able to play kings off against each other.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at this point, there's nobody to play off.
Right.
I do think one thing that so basically, just to kind of recap where we're at right now, we've got sort of Andalusian Spain and Aquitaine. We've got kind of a more prominent Viking France and probably England, because England is now very isolated on their own. They don't have the ability to call for any real diplomatic ties with anybody across the channel. So they're kind of out for themselves. They're sort of going to have to deal with it. I do wonder if the Byzantines, I guess the real question is, in terms of the long development specifically of Christianity, do they kind of just entrench? Are they sort of in the immediate sort of old Roman territory? Do they try and fast forward what they did in the 900s and 1000s, where they try and start converting Eastern Europe and the Eastern Germanic territories and kind of go that way?
Yeah,
And since they consider
way,
Western Europe kind of lost, quote unquote.
I think they head that direction because
Yes.
they can't penetrate it, and you might, if anything, you end up something with what looks like what the Spanish monks tried with North America.
Yeah.
Where they send the priest into North America to try to convert. It doesn't go well, so they back off,
Yeah.
basically.
Or almost kind of a version of like what they did when they went up the Volga into when they converted Russia.
That's another
sort of
another good one. Yeah.
Because I think the Vikings, I think once they have a foothold in sort of Northern Europe, because really the only problem with the Vikings is that they couldn't grow any food. That's the problem with Scandinavia. So once you have Vikings that can, and Norse cultures that can get further south,
and get
their ability to entrench becomes a big question in the development.
I think the issue is, like, it depends upon how they fight. Like the Vikings, as you mentioned, are very good at river fighting, but they don't grow anything. Everything they do is based around where are the rivers that we can go up and grab stuff.
Yeah.
And
so I think
when they run into other groups that like actually build and develop areas, they're not as successful.
Yeah, I'm almost picturing like most of, and this isn't even getting into what the changes are going to be to a sort of overall Viking culture once they can start tacking onto some of the post-Roman developments of like, organization and politics and society that the Franks could get from the Romans. I'm almost envisioning, there's enough rivers in northern France and the Low Countries, northern Germany around like Hamburg and kind of Bremen, and sort of like Denmark, the
where the
Peninsula.
Hanseatic League was.
Exactly. But once you get into the German heartland, like I think Hanover is probably about as far into central Germany as they may ever kind of really get. So that is probably where the Christians end up getting the farthest north.
what was going through my mind, kind of what I was talking about earlier with almost a geographic determinism. If you have a Al-Andalus that can get over the Rhine into the North German plain, that's when cavalry becomes important again.
Yeah.
So I think that you might have a swath going almost from like Normandy to almost Hanover, like you said, central Germany, of these two groups having some kind of natural advantage when it comes to dealing with these two groups clashing because both of them have an advantage in this area over others.
Yeah, and I think that becomes kind of where, almost like when the Mongols came into Eastern Europe in the sort of 1300s, I think it's the same situation on the other end of Germany, where you have, you know, Christian forces and Muslim forces kind of clashing on those plains. I think expecting Islamic advances kind of past, I'm looking at a map here, like Nancy or like Frankfurt, that's kind of stretching them a little bit from their sort of natural power base, but I can see that being sort of, you know, basically essentially on the Maginot Line, kind of where all the big fighting and battles become prominent.
But so what we're talking about now is kind of a, without the Frankish Thuringia Germany kind of thing. Now we have kind of a Lombard Germanic.
Yeah. A much more Lombardy and sort of Swabian, Bavarian kind of Germanic power base.
Do they now, what is their kind of northern border with? Do they go right up against kind of a Hanover, kind of a Bielefeld, Paderborn?
Yeah, I think you're probably looking at, and I think one thing is our understanding of what is quote unquote German is probably different. I think it's much more Bohemian and kind of Czech before it was Czech.
Yeah.
Because though, you know, the kings of Bohemia were in the sort of big Middle Ages, they were kind of the main power brokers before the Habsburgs got to be sort of the Habsburgs, you know, in like Prague and sort of around there. So I think, you know, that is going to be sort of where Germany kind of begins consolidating. And you're probably going to look basically like what is kind of the South German sort of confederation, the Confederation of the Rhine kind of, that's going to be, I think, kind of Germany.
Okay.
And sort of northern Germany around Hamburg is going to be almost like a Viking Saxony kind of deal.
Yeah, the Vikings are running that along with the German. And so my question would be then, do you end up with somewhat of a merger between the Viking and Germanic cultures over time?
I don't think there's that much of a merger that really has to happen, because they're not that far diverged from each other at this point.
Right.
You know, the great tree at Irminsul, like the big pagan tree that was, you know, kind of in the Germanic and Norse sort of pagan ideology, that wasn't destroyed until I think the time of Charlemagne. So it's still standing probably. Like that whole strip is probably still very much, you know, whether it's sort of like Odin and Thor or Wotan and whatever, you know, it's all kind of flavors in the same sort of thing. It's kind of like jambalaya, gumbo, and etouffee. It's all Cajun food. It's just kind of different flavors. I think it's going to be much more confederative in that sense, where you'll have independent, you know, the Viking Normans will be much more like classic quote unquote Viking, but a Germanic Saxony and a Viking Normandy are going to naturally be much closer together culturally, systematically, religiously, because they were already like that already.
They were there. So, yeah.
And I think the other thing that's interesting, and this is, you know, to kind of shift gears back down south a little bit, this is also, so 750, Al-Andalus breaks off from kind of the old Islamic Caliphate. This is also right before the beginning, like this is literally a couple of decades from the big kickoff of the Islamic Golden Age. Once the Caliph starts moving all of these texts from Indian philosophy and Southeast Asian philosophy and Persian philosophy and even old Greek texts that the Byzantines had kind of forgotten about. They got copies of all these, translated them into Arabic.
Roman text as
classical
well.
Roman texts. All of this becomes housed in the House of Wisdom starting in like the mid 800s, right as all of this consolidation that we've been talking about in the northern Germanic sort of Norse Normandy and all of this has been happening that we've just been talking about. Well, if you have a sort of southern, like an Aquitanian Muslim Al-Andalus that has a much more direct connection to the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, because they're Islamic, there's much more, even if they're independent states separate from each other, there's going to be much more freedom of travel. You don't have, the Mediterranean is a much more questionable in terms of who has, control over the ships that go back and forth. So if you have easier access to all of this stuff that really jumpstarts the Islamic Golden Age and causes our medieval Europe to kind of lag behind by, philosophically 200, 300, or even 400 years in certain aspects, does that help jumpstart some philosophical developments that were basically kind of left by the wayside since the fall of Rome? Basically, does, some of the developments about philosophy and representation and just mathematics and things like that, does that end up re-entering Europe more easily, more quickly in this timeline? Because, regardless of how much, opposition Muslim Aquitaine would have against Norman France and Christian Lombard Italy, ideas don't really have trouble crossing those borders. So I wonder if basically what becomes the Renaissance in our timeline happens a little bit earlier because of this easier access and diffusion potentially to sort of Muslim ideas from the Golden Age. Or, and if we really want to get wacky alt history here, what if the Vikings get a hold of it? What if the Vikings actually get a written language instead of runes and start developing some of those philosophies? What if Antonio Banderas' The 13th Warrior was actually a documentary about how the Vikings became civilized? I did tell you I was going wacky. Chris is looking at me like, what is going on right now?
I 100% think the Renaissance occurs much earlier. Much, much earlier. Because and I'll use the archaic term that we all learned. Okay, I'll date myself. That I learned when I learned world history, the Dark Ages gets cut in half. Because now you have the Anglo-Saxon influence bumping up against the Islams. The Islams are down in the south. Maybe you got a thin sliver of Franks, but the Frankish there in Charles is pretty much put by the wayside. So you don't end up with the Holy Roman Empire. Charles's influence of developing feudalism is tamped down as well.
Yep.
So now, and you don't have the overarching piece of the Catholic Church influence. You basically upended that whole societal construct. So now I think that I think there is no Silk Road that helps influence the Renaissance. The Renaissance just occurs as a natural consequence of these kingdoms being butt up against each other.
Yeah.
Through it.
Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest, regardless of what happens with the geopolitical development of all these new kingdoms that we've created. I think that's probably the biggest knock-on effect that would drastically impact the overall development of the entire world. Is if you have that, one, you don't even have feudalism as the same, pervasive concept. It's the Catholic Church would probably still make sure that feudalism in some sense is, or a version of it is kind of the regime du jour of, these kind of cavalry-focused Germanic states in that area. But, especially in sort of Western Europe, you're going to have a much more kind of civil administration focus that you get from the Islamic tradition. The Byzantines are going to Byzantine. So I think there's going to be much less because there are fewer feudal rulers who are threatened by the loss of their absolute top-down power. I think the Renaissance is going to naturally diffuse a little bit more. Plus, the Silk Road, one of the big problems with the Silk Road from the Christian perspective is, except for the part that ended in Moscow and Kiev, all of it went through Islamic territory.
Yep.
Well, now that doesn't really matter because the Silk Road going through Islamic territory ends in Toulouse. It hooks around the long way. So it doesn't matter. It's just coming from a different direction, but it almost has an easier way to get there.
Easier
because,
access.
Yeah, you're going straight from Islamic territory to Christian territory, not through, the vast swath of steppe.
Yeah.
And then sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I also wonder, one concrete example of this sort of diffusion of knowledge would be map making, because the Islamic world, especially in the Golden Age, had a much better understanding of the contours of the world, at least as far as the Eastern Hemisphere goes, Europe, Africa, Asia. So once you start having some of that knowledge get diffused, then it gets really interesting what, like you said, Robert, with some of you made an analogy to the Spanish missionaries in North America. That, does the age of exploration get jump started or start looking very differently in this timeline than it does in ours? Because all of these maps are much more diffuse everywhere. More people, just in general, have a more accurate understanding of what more of the world looks like. Marco Polo is probably not a celebrity. Ironically enough, that means pasta probably doesn't come to Italy, at least in the same way. Sorry, don't mean to offend any Italian listeners, but pasta was one of the things, like a version of pasta, noodles, was brought back by Marco Polo in his expedition to Italy. So
there's that mute button. Actually, more importantly, here's what I'm thinking about. I don't necessarily think the Vikings develop a language. I don't think they don't develop cities. But what I think may be interesting is, we know they discovered I'll concede they did land in Canada. If they have map making technology, that could be a very important thing where you see a North America.
Well, and they were further south to begin with agriculture. So they would want to go down the coast into what we think of as New England, the upper mid-Atlantic states, down maybe even as far as south as Connecticut, for sure.
And they would be able to understand how to get back there.
Yep. Yeah. And okay, now here's the one wild card we haven't thrown out. What does this do to Britain?
And that's kind of the question. I think Britain
goes Viking.
I think.
Oh, really?
I think there's a much stronger and more permanent Viking presence.
By the way, keep in mind, from a political
Alexis
structure,
might have words on that, but go ahead.
You know what? If you've taken freaking pasta from my cold dead hand, Alexa can freaking show up, okay? Think about it from the political structure. Britain did go Viking.
Yeah.
Who are the Normans?
Yeah.
What is the Norman conquest?
Yeah.
Because then that impacts what happens with what we just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I just think if you look at it from the perspective of just look at it on a map. If we've got the Norse into Normandy, into the Low Country, into northern Germany, Britain is cut off and surrounded, basically.
Yeah. I think the question of, I think it becomes more of a perception in sort of, how we understand 2,000 years on what Britain's relation is to the rest of Europe.
I think Britain looks at itself almost like Iceland does.
That's exactly.
Oh, there you go.
It's,
That's
it's
a
much
really
more tied
good-
to the Germanic,
Yeah.
Scandinavian, Icelandic
Hey,
sphere
because
and the
guess
North
what?
Sea.
Where are the Anglo-Saxons?
The Angles and the Saxons from? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, okay, so here's my next one. So
Mhm.
I've got to jump all the way into the 1600s to get to this, but
Ooh.
we've just really disrupted everything, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Do we get 92 thesis on a church door in Wittenberg?
No.
I don't think so either. That's why
The
I brought it
90
up.
well, the
Because I
92
100%
thesis.
don't think we get that.
The 92 theses
Yeah.
are a reaction to the power of the Pope.
The Pope, exactly
the
my
Pope
point.
has no power.
No power.
No power.
Uh-huh.
The Pope has the same power as any Orthodox patriarch. That's what they
Mhm.
are.
Yeah. And I guess this may be a question because I don't, I grew up
That totally
Catholic.
disrupts the whole
Yeah. Well, and I don't know because
where it's
the
built.
whole interpretation of the Bible and Scripture through the priest and the restrictions of the Latin Rite Mass. I don't know if that's an Orthodox thing. I know that was a Catholic thing. I don't know how much that was a
It
Greek
is not
Orthodox
an
thing.
it was not a Greek Orthodox thing.
Yeah. So the
At all.
issues that give rise to the theses, I don't think are even on the ground.
At
Right.
least at a minimum, the Martin Luther version of the
Yeah.
Reformation. Now you might get the Knox version and the Calvin version
Mhm.
and some of the others out there, but having
But-
that sort of
I think the thing is
a different look
when you look at
completely
the
for
when
Reformation.
you look at the Orthodox Church,
Mhm.
there is not a hierarchy.
There's
There
not.
is nobody that says this is what being Orthodox means.
Yep.
If there's nobody saying what it means to be Orthodox, you cannot have Protestants
Yeah.
because
Yep.
there is nobody saying you're on the other side of this line. If there's nobody to draw that line.
Well, and that gets to a thing that I think is going to be a broader trend, not just specifically in Christianity, but in religion in general in this timeline, is if you have, more entrenched Viking Norse paganism in Northern Europe, you have a reduced and sort of orthodoxized Christianity, but you also have what is probably in southern France going to be a much more Moorish Andalusian style of Islamic rule, where it's okay, people of the book, they're cool. You might have to pay a little more tax, very Roman style. I think it's going to be a much less homogenized, by region
Mhm.
what
religious
you're
makeup.
going to see is, I think that's a very interesting idea of a competition between there is nothing but Orthodox
Yeah,
Christianity.
just Christianity at this point. We're not going to worry about the distinction.
Yeah.
But
you get Christianity. Yep.
almost a pluralistic race
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
between Al-Andalus and Christianity as to who can theologically accept themselves to Norse mythology better, because that's going to, think about
that was one of the tools that was used to convert Norse and pagan areas, was
And
that
it was
analogizing.
also a tool that was very important in Catholicism spread to Mexico, the ability of
Mhm.
those monks we were talking about to incorporate local religious practices.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's the Europe is going to be a much more kind of pluralistic. I hate to use such a very American phrase, but and I'm not saying this is how it's going to be, but it's going to be more like this. It's almost going to be, at least in the religious sphere, more of a kind of free exchange of ideas as these different religious groups. We're going to see variations on these.
Mhm.
I hate to call them heresies because that's again gets back to the sort of orthodoxy versus non-orthodoxy, but you're going to see very different flavors of all three of these branches of religion.
Here's an interesting question I have. What do developments in kind of the home of Islam have to do with what happens in Al-Andalus? you have other caliphates coming up, and they are doing what I just said, which is drawing lines as to what it means to be a Muslim and what it means to not be. Does that lead to conflict between Al-Andalus and other caliphate, kind of other Muslim lands? Does that lead to those ideas coming into Al-Andalus, and you have a pluralistic Christianity, but not a pluralistic Islam there? Does kind of Al-Andalus develop its own blend of
Muslim?
Yeah. So I think
basically, did the Muslim split is the question here.
Well, and I think that very much the way I think it's going to play out is that very much is going to be sort of the Islamic world's kind of budding question.
Yeah.
That is brewing right up until the late 1200s, when all of that is made completely irrelevant.
Mongols.
Yep. Now, I think the Mongols don't get as far into the sort of Levant area, because with this timeline, I think very arguably there are no crusades, at least in the Holy Land, because I don't think the Catholics have enough power to do them.
No.
But at the same time, the Byzantines, because they've essentially gotten an injection of vitamins in the arm, they're not
dead cat drop. I love that, but
the
they're
dead
not,
cat bounce.
Yeah, they don't get a dead cat bounce.
So I think
because they're not falling.
Yeah.
It's not because they're not bouncing. They're not falling.
Yeah, there's no fall.
But I think what the Mongols do is I think they add in enough destabilization from what has, for the last 600 years up until this time, been the super secure Muslim heartland of Arabia and Persia. I think the Mongols add enough of a destabilizing factor to that. And then once the Mongols do their thing and they kind of break apart into the different khanates, I think that then sort of breaks up enough of the Muslim hegemony into different polities that it becomes more like the sort of fractured chessboard of Europe.
Yeah, there's another interesting idea, which is the Mongols in kind of Golden Horde form in Russia, or whatever Russia is, interacting with Viking polities, which are now also very different.
Yeah, and I don't know how that one goes, because you probably also have much more focused direction from the Orthodox side of things, from the Byzantines and from Eastern Europe towards Russia and the Baltics. So, that sort of area, the sort of, Muscovy principalities is kind of, I almost imagine, going to be very Balkan-esque in the modern kind of understanding, where that's where there's a bunch of different people ruling a bunch of different places, and they're all blowing each other up for one various reason or another, because of religion, because of all this stuff in this kind of time period. I think, kind of like central Germany becomes the battleground between sort of like the Christians and the pagans and the Muslims from Toulouse. I think the sort of Ukrainian, Volga steppes kind of do the same thing from the other end.
I'm just a little hesitant on that, just because there are no natural boundaries. Like, whenever you have a polity, it is going to keep expanding till it hits something.
Yeah. But I think the Vikings, at this point, are completely unlike the Vikings that we understand. But at the very least, they're going to have a much stronger presence around Kiev and on some of those rivers through Eastern Europe.
Yeah, they get that.
Depending on what settlements develop, there may be some.
That's actually an interesting thought, which is modern Russia traces its development to the adoption of Orthodox Christianity by Kievan Rus, because there isn't kind of a unified pagan Norse polity. If there is such a thing, maybe Orthodoxy doesn't jump the Black Sea.
Yeah. Or at least it doesn't go widespread beyond the Black Sea.
Or it's working its way up to Romania, Moldova.
It's not as direct.
It goes more
around.
east.
Yeah.
So very interesting. I think we have successfully completely changed the entire development of history after about the early 700s with this one. So if we ever got ambitious, this was the episode that we've successfully done it.
I haven't drawn the entire line. I do not think this prevents World War II, though.
Oh, of course. No, there's going to be some version. It's always going to happen. So I guess just a quick recap where we ended up. So we have a successful Muslim acquisition of Aquitaine somehow leads to, let me see if I can get everything checked off the list. Not really a schism between Christianity and Catholicism and Orthodoxy. More entrenched Norse presence in northern Germany and in northern France to become essentially a Viking kingdom,
along with Britain,
and the Low Countries,
and New England, because the Vikings get over there. We have a earlier Renaissance, no feudalism or less feudalism, leading to a philosophically widely more diffused and pluralistic sort of attitude across much of Europe. No crusades, so that's a nice big one. What essentially amounts to a three-way religious, not conflict, more like competition between sort of a resurgent Germanic paganism, Islam, and Christianity. And no Charlemagne. Let's not forget that. There's no Holy Roman Empire, at least in its current form. So there's no sort of giant polity that controls, a large swath of Europe. It's much less centralized. Did I forget anything? Did I leave anything out? Any final thoughts that we want to tack on to as we
don't get a Reformation because there is
no Reformation, yeah.
Which is pretty huge. I mean,
Martin Luther's got to go find something else to do.
Yeah.
Probably, actually, ironically enough, the development of the printing press is probably very different as well, because you don't, in a world where the Islamic Golden Age allows for a much more natural diffusion of information, I'm sure there is still a development of a printing press, because the Chinese developed it in 900.
Mm-hmm.
But it does not take off like wildfire with the ability to print a previously unreadable book like the Bible.
Not to prolong this, but you don't have a whole bunch of vested interest trying to keep it out. So if you do have a more exploratory and experimental society, I think maybe you do have a printing press develop earlier.
You probably do have it developed earlier. It just doesn't. It's much more natural of a progression. It's instead of like a geometric curve.
It's not the.
It's not a bang.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
a gentle upslope.
Yeah. It happens. People can now read. They have lots of things to read, and it's not like, oh my God, this is amazing. I could never see the Bible before, and now I can, because that was one of the pieces that triggered the Reformation, or fueled the Reformation would be the right answer to it.
Yeah. So I dare say in some ways, this is actually a much more pleasant version of the Middle Ages in some ways.
So the other thing just to think about, and we talked about the Norse in kind of Canada, New England. If you don't have, not to get too kind of guns, germs, and steel on us, but if you don't have Europe being constantly at war with each other in itself, and my initial thought was even just, you don't have the Spanish Empire because you don't have all of these soldiers sitting around ready to go in 1492. Do you have European hegemony that we do? Because they spend time thinking about printing presses.
And I think that's
and other things rather than war.
Yes, I think that's kind of been the undercurrent of most of this episode. Is I think the sort of three axes that we've talked about are all, they're not necessarily completely equal, but they're much more equal. They're much more against each other. in terms of even competition. It's much less violent, potentially competition at certain points, at least. Yeah, I think it's a much more tripolar medieval and early modern world in terms of, instead of just being the sort of Europeans running rampant over everything that they want to get at. Man, this was this is an interesting episode. I didn't even expect all this when I came up with the idea.
Well, it's like we talked about, the battle we forked at wasn't the wasn't the big consequence.
Yeah,
which is kind of unusual than a lot of our forks.
You did leave something off.
Okay.
Pasta. You have made an enemy today.
I'm not saying it doesn't still get here. It's too delicious not to get here. I'm just saying Marco Polo doesn't get the credit for it.
Okay.
Marco Polo ends up being some backwater, Venetian swamp guy.
Like he's DoorDash. Merchant. That's what he is. He's DoorDash.
He is basically DoorDash. Yeah, the Venetian trade empire runs not on spices and gold. It runs on food delivery.
I don't even know why I'm taking that so personal, because technically he's in a different polity now. He's not even in Italy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he would be in Lombardy, not in Venice.
Italy starts at Rome. That is the official policy.
Yeah, but Marco Polo was Venetian.
Yeah. So he wasn't Italian.
Yeah, that's what I said. He was Lombard. Yeah. So, all right. I think we've as Stalin would say, I think we've about squeezed all the blood from this turnip. Any last final thoughts before we wrap up?
Does Stalin still have?
No, stop it. Actually, maybe Stalin becomes a priest.
Yeah.
Maybe he stays a priest in this timeline. Anyway, okay. I think that's about it. I think my brain has taken all that I can take for one afternoon.
Although I will throw a possibility of a part 2 out, because Chris, I don't think we get World War II, because you don't get World War I in the same way. And if you don't have World War I, you don't get World War II.
There is no way you can have a like we haven't.
I said in the same way.
You still have a tripolar world. Or whatever.
It is something totally different.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, someone has to figure out what happens with Switzerland. So maybe that's what World War I breaks out over. The eternal Swiss neutrality gets resolved in a 3-way World War I. So anyway, I think that about finishes it up. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking a ride with us on what ended up being a very detour-laden adventure all over history on this episode of A Fork in Time. And gentlemen, as we always end these episodes, I have one last question for you. If you should run across a fork in time, what should you do?
Should always take it.
Thanks, everyone. Tune in next time. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on here with me. As always, it is a pleasure and a privilege, and everyone have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.